In the pre-dawn stillness of July 16, 1945, as a pale desert wind moved across the Jornada del Muerto basin in southern New Mexico, a handful of men stood in a bunker and waited to see if the world would end. They had calculated blast yields, drawn shockwave curves, and argued about neutron cross-sections on blackboards in windowless rooms. They had signed documents swearing eternal secrecy. They had ridden horses past rattlesnakes and watched the sky turn molten with summer lightning. But none of them, neither the pipe-smoking theorist from Europe nor the ranch boy from New Mexico who now guarded the gate, could say with certainty that the device, perched on a steel tower a few miles away, would not ignite the atmosphere itself. If it did, history would remember nothing. If it did not, history would change forever. What the world would come to call the Trinity Test was the blazing climax of the Manhattan Project, the vast, secret American effort to build an atomic bomb before Nazi Germany. But buried inside that enormous enterprise was a quieter, stranger operation, an operation that unfolded not in Berlin or Tokyo, but in the American Southwest, among adobe villages, cattle ranches, and sunburned mesas. It was an operation of deception and counterintelligence, of ghostly shipments on desert highways and coded telegrams from Washington, of physicists who hunted quarks by day and spies by night. Some of the men involved would later refer to it half-jokingly as Operation Stardust. Officially, no such name existed. Unofficially, it was the shield that kept the greatest scientific gamble in history from being undone by a single well-placed whisper. The American Southwest in 1942 did not look like the birthplace of the atomic age. It looked timeless. In northern New Mexico, Pueblo communities traced their lineage back centuries. In Santa Fe, artists painted desert light while tourists strolled past the palace of the governors. In the Tularosa Basin, ranchers measured their days by the movement of cattle and the promise of rain. Then, in the winter of 1942, strangers began to arrive. They came in government sedans with Washington plates and in army trucks that kicked up long plumes of dust. They carried clipboards and wore expressions that suggested urgency without explanation. One of the men at the center of this quiet invasion was Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, a broad-shouldered officer with a reputation for bluntness and a mind like a ledger book. Groves had already overseen the construction of the Pentagon. Now, in September 1942, he had been placed in charge of the Manhattan Project, a project whose very name was designed to mislead. Groves understood two things better than most: that building an atomic bomb would require unprecedented resources, and keeping it secret would require unprecedented discipline. He selected a remote plateau near Santa Fe as the site for a new laboratory. The area was known locally as Los Alamos Ranch School, a boys' school perched high above the Rio Grande. The school would be closed. The plateau would be seized under wartime authority. Fences would go up. Armed guards would stand watch. The laboratory would be led by a theoretical physicist named J. Robert Oppenheimer, a man whose gaunt frame and penetrating eyes concealed a restless brilliance. Oppenheimer had spent years studying quantum mechanics in Europe and teaching at Berkeley. He loved poetry as much as equations. He could quote the Bhagavad Gita from memory. He was also, in the eyes of some in Washington, politically suspect, having once moved in circles that included leftist sympathizers. Groves chose him anyway. Oppenheimer knew the terrain. He had ridden horses in the New Mexico mountains and fallen in love with the stark beauty of the Southwest. He understood both the science and the isolation required. In early 1943, he gathered a small group of physicists, chemists, metallurgists, and engineers, and moved them to the newly christened Los Alamos Laboratory. The address they were given was simple: P.O. Box 1663, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Their families followed, bewildered but loyal. Wives who had imagined a life in Berkeley or Princeton now found themselves hauling water up dusty roads. Children played in the shadow of barbed wire fences. Mail was censored. Telephones were monitored. Even the town's name was classified. To the outside world, Los Alamos did not exist. But secrecy is never absolute. It is a constant struggle against entropy, against curiosity, loose talk, and enemies who are listening. By 1943, American intelligence officials knew that German scientists, including Werner Heisenberg, were pursuing nuclear research under the Third Reich. They also knew that the Soviet Union, nominally an ally against Hitler, had a formidable intelligence apparatus with agents embedded across Europe and the United States. The Manhattan Project was so large, employing more than 130,000 people at sites in Tennessee, Washington State, Illinois, and New Mexico, that total invisibility was impossible. The challenge was to make it look like something else. This was where the covert operations began to intertwine with physics. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, vast facilities enriched uranium under the guise of chemical production. In Hanford, Washington, reactors bred plutonium, described in official documents as part of an unspecified ordnance program. Trains moved materials labeled with harmless codes. Workers were told only what they needed to know. But in the Southwest, at Los Alamos, and in the surrounding desert, the secret was more concentrated and more fragile. Rumors spread quickly in small communities. Ranchers noticed army patrols where none had been before. Pilots flying over restricted airspace were warned away by radio. A remote bombing range in the Tularosa Basin was expanded without explanation. Local newspapers received vague statements about war-related activities. The Army's Counterintelligence Corps, working with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, established a quiet presence in Santa Fe and Albuquerque. Agents rented rooms in boarding houses and listened for unusual questions. They monitored letters and tracked the movements of foreign-born scientists. The irony was sharp. Many of the scientists building the bomb were themselves refugees from fascism, Jewish physicists who had fled Nazi Germany and Austria. They had escaped persecution, only to find themselves under suspicion in their adopted country. One of the most brilliant among them was a Hungarian émigré whose ideas about nuclear chain reactions had helped spark the entire project. He worried constantly that the bomb might be used not just against Germany, but as a political tool in a post-war world. He wrote letters urging caution. Those letters were intercepted, copied, and filed. Secrecy bred paranoia. In early 1944, a small team within Army intelligence began compiling what they called vulnerability assessments of the Manhattan Project's southwestern operations. They examined everything from rail lines to laboratory waste disposal. They considered scenarios that ranged from sabotage by disgruntled workers to infiltration by foreign agents posing as technicians. The desert itself posed unique challenges. It was vast, difficult to patrol, and crisscrossed by old ranch trails and dry arroyos that could conceal movement. The skies were clear, making aerial reconnaissance easy. The nearest cities, Albuquerque and El Paso, were large enough to hide strangers. To address these risks, the Army established layers of security. Access roads to Los Alamos were guarded by military police who checked badges and inspected vehicles. The surrounding land was posted with signs warning of restricted areas. Patrols roamed the perimeter at night. Yet the most significant threats were not likely to come through barbed wire. They would come through conversation. At Los Alamos, scientists lived and worked in close quarters. They debated theoretical problems over dinner and scribbled equations on napkins.
They attended lectures by visiting experts. They formed friendships and sometimes romantic entanglements. In such an environment, ideas flowed freely. That was necessary for scientific progress. It was also dangerous. The Army imposed a system of compartmentalization. Researchers working on the implosion design for the plutonium bomb did not have full access to data on uranium enrichment. Chemists processing explosive lenses did not necessarily know the exact physics of the core they would compress. Oppenheimer walked a delicate line. He believed that collaboration was essential to solve the unprecedented technical problems they faced. He also knew that too much openness could be catastrophic. Behind the scenes, intelligence officers reviewed background checks and compiled reports on individual scientists. Some names were flagged for past associations with leftist groups. Interviews were conducted discreetly. Promotions were delayed. In a few cases, clearances were revoked. The tension was palpable. And yet, progress continued. By late 1944, the focus at Los Alamos had shifted decisively toward the implosion design. The simpler gun-type uranium bomb, later dropped on Hiroshima, was considered reliable enough that it would not require a full-scale test. The plutonium bomb, however, posed enormous uncertainties. Its design required symmetrical compression of a plutonium core using precisely shaped explosive charges, an engineering challenge unlike anything attempted before. To test it, the scientists needed a remote location where they could detonate a device equivalent to thousands of tons of TNT. They found it in the Jornada del Muerto, Journey of the Dead Man, a desolate stretch of desert within the Alamogordo bombing range. Preparations for the test, codenamed Trinity, began in early 1945. A steel tower 100 feet tall was erected in the desert. Instrumentation bunkers were built at varying distances to measure blast pressure, heat, and radiation. Cameras were set up to capture the fireball. Everything had to be transported over rough roads, often at night. It was during these months that the covert dimension of the operation intensified. The movement of special nuclear material, plutonium cores, detonators, and initiators, required extraordinary security. Convoys traveled under armed guard, their contents disguised in unmarked containers. Drivers were instructed not to stop except in emergencies. Routes were varied to avoid patterns. Intelligence officers feared not only enemy agents, but also accidental exposure. A traffic accident, a curious local sheriff, or an inquisitive journalist could unravel months of careful deception. One particularly sensitive shipment involved the plutonium core itself, machined into two hemispheres and nicknamed the Gadget. It traveled by military aircraft and by car, accompanied by armed couriers who carried sidearms and sealed orders. They were instructed that, if necessary, they were to protect the cargo at all costs. As the test date approached, meteorological teams tracked wind patterns obsessively. A wrong shift in wind direction could carry radioactive fallout toward populated areas. The nearest towns, Socorro, Carrizoso, and even parts of Albuquerque were within theoretical range. To prepare for the possibility of public inquiry, the Army drafted a cover story. If the explosion were noticed, officials would announce that an ammunition dump had accidentally detonated at the Alamogordo Air Base. Press releases were written in advance. In the early hours of July 16, 1945, thunderstorms delayed the test. Scientists and soldiers huddled in bunkers, watching lightning flash across the desert. Finally, at 5:29 a.m., the countdown reached zero. The world's first nuclear explosion lit the sky with a brightness greater than the sun. The fireball rose, forming a mushroom cloud that climbed miles into the atmosphere. Shock waves shattered windows in distant towns. Observers felt heat on their faces from miles away. Oppenheimer later recalled a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." But in the immediate aftermath, amid the awe and terror, there was also relief. The atmosphere had not ignited, the desert had not swallowed them, the device had worked. Within hours, military police were dispatched to patrol the perimeter and collect fragments of fused desert sand, later called trinitite. Scientists analyzed data. Intelligence officers monitored phone lines and local radio stations for unusual reports. The pre-written cover story was released. An ammunition dump had exploded, officials said. There was no cause for alarm. Some locals accepted the explanation. Others were skeptical. Ranchers had seen the light and felt the blast. One woman reportedly thought the end of the world had come. The covert shield held. Less than a month later, on August 6, 1945, a uranium bomb nicknamed Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a plutonium bomb, Fat Man, detonated over Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15. The war ended. The atomic age began. Yet the secrets of the Southwest did not vanish with the war. Instead, they deepened. In the months and years that followed, evidence emerged that the Soviet Union had obtained significant information about the Manhattan Project through espionage. One of the most notorious cases involved a young physicist at Los Alamos who passed details of the implosion design to Soviet handlers. His actions would not become public until years later, when he confessed and was tried. The realization that spies had penetrated the project shook American confidence. It also validated the fears that had driven the covert measures in the Southwest. Historians would later debate how much difference those stolen secrets made to the Soviet atomic program. What was clear was that the desert laboratory had been both a fortress and a sieve, protected by layers of security, yet vulnerable to human conviction. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, as Cold War tensions escalated, the Southwest became even more central to America's nuclear enterprise. Los Alamos expanded. A second laboratory was established in Livermore, California. The Nevada test site was opened for atmospheric tests. But Trinity remained singular, the moment when theory became fire. For the people of New Mexico, the legacy was complex. Some felt pride that their land had hosted a scientific achievement that ended a brutal war. Others pointed to the downwind communities exposed to fallout, to cancers that appeared years later, to a silence that lasted decades. In recent years, historians and descendants have pieced together the human stories behind the secrecy. They have examined declassified documents, interviewed surviving participants, and walked the desert where the tower once stood. What emerges is not a simple tale of triumph or betrayal, but a layered narrative of urgency, fear, brilliance, and moral ambiguity. The covert operations in the American Southwest during World War II were not as cinematic as parachutes dropping into occupied France. There were no dramatic firefights in the streets of Santa Fe. Instead, the battles were fought in filing cabinets and security briefings, in decisions about who could know what and when. They were fought in the tension between open science and closed secrets. They were fought in the knowledge that a single leak could alter the balance of power in a world already at war. Operation Stardust, if one chooses to call it that, was the invisible architecture that allowed the visible explosion to occur. It was the network of guards, code names, cover stories, and quiet investigations that kept the desert experiment hidden long enough to change history. On certain days of the year, the Trinity site is open to the public. Visitors drive through the same stark landscape and stand near a small obelisk marking Ground Zero. They take photographs. They read plaques describing the dawn of the atomic age. The desert looks peaceful now. The wind still moves across the Jornada del Muerto. The sky still stretches vast and indifferent above the mesas. But beneath that quiet lies the memory of a moment when a secret kept in the American Southwest reshaped the fate of nations. And in that memory, one can still sense the fragile line between knowledge and catastrophe. The line walked by men and women who carried stardust in steel containers across lonely highways, knowing that the future of the world rode with them.